I met Olivia Hart in the fall of 2010 at a campus voter registration drive. She stood beneath a banner that said, Civic Engagement Week, and had a clipboard in one hand and a thermos in the other. Hair in a messy bun. Eyebrows sewn together as if the world had just testified against itself and she was the jury. I was a philosophy major who had taken a week of comparative politics. Mostly because my roommate begged me. I remember thinking she was fierce before she even opened her mouth. When she smiled at me later, rare, luminous, like sunlight through blinds, I felt something anchor. We started out like a lot of college relationships, earnest, loud, and caffeinated. Olivia loved debate and the language of change. She could sketch the flaws in a policy and trace them back to a history class story that made the injustice feel immediate. I liked how she refused easy comfort. I liked, too, that she liked me. She noticed the little things. How I liked my coffee with too much sugar. How I always carried a dog-eared copy of Camus in my backpack. And she would tease me about them like they were evidence in her case for loving me. After graduation we stayed in the city. She took a job with a nonprofit, an organization that organized campus chapters to lobby for voting rights protections. I took a stable analyst role at a manufacturing firm. The kind of job that taught me to enjoy the quiet architecture of spreadsheets and the satisfying clink when reports balanced. We weren't glamorous. Rent was an argument. Groceries were strategic. But we had the small rituals that scaffolded a life together. Thursday night was when we tried new recipes. Sunday mornings we walked the neighborhood farmers market and argued about whether the Honey Guys product was actually local. On bad days she would rant about the inefficacy of public policy. On better ones she would bring home pastry and make me listen to a podcast she loved. Olivia was outspoken, and that was part of what drew me to her. She had a feminist philosophy that was rigorous and compassionate. She read widely, filed things in her mind like an archivist, and expected the people around her to do the same. Not to be pedantic, but because she believed knowledge shaped action. Her insistence that we examine our comforts and complicities made me better in ways I'd later understand only in retrospect. At first, that insistence was an engine of care. She would read my writing, correct my missteps in interviews, and push me to ask for raises. If I procrastinated on a project, she'd sit with me and help me break it into pieces. She was both critique and crucible. Demanding, yes, but because she believed in sharpening whatever she loved. The small reciprocity felt real. I organized our calendars, reminded her of appointments, picked up prescriptions while she stayed late at the office. We celebrated each other's wins. She clapped loudest when I got a promotion. I applauded when she finally moved from coordinator to director at the nonprofit. But the axis of our life began to tilt when public attention found Olivia. It crept in at first, op-eds, LinkedIn shoutouts, invitations to speak at panels. She was articulate, and when she spoke about structural inequalities there was a clarity that made people lean in. The internet, in its ambivalent way, rewarded her. Followers scrolled to her posts. Colleagues quoted her lines. And colleagues of colleagues asked her to moderate discussions. She learned the rhythms of a public role. The short-form takes. The crafted statements. The careful photos. I was proud, secretly, almost selfishly proud, that she filled rooms with ideas. What I didn't anticipate was how the public role would bend and then stretch the private one. The activism that had felt like a shared cause at first began to require certain optics. Olivia, who had once rolled her eyes at performative gestures, found that polishing a speech and curating a social feed extended her platform. There were benefits. Donors opened doors, which helped the nonprofit, and sometimes her work made tangible difference. But there was also a small corrosion of attention. At first the cracks were tiny and we smoothed them with jokes. When she asked that I accompany her to a fundraiser, I did. When she wanted me to promote a campaign on my personal feed, I did. Even though I preferred to keep my social media quiet, she began to catalog things in public ways, thanking me in posts with hashtags that made me feel simultaneously appreciated and cast as a supporting character. I liked being in the background as long as being in the background felt chosen. But slowly that feeling slipped from chosen to expected. Her standards for herself were fierce. She demanded the same precision from others. Where she once gently urged friends to reflect, she began to police. If someone used the wrong pronoun, she would correct them mid-sentence. Not in the spirit of education but in a way that made the person shrink. If a colleague omitted a historical nuance in a talk, she would publicly annotate their remark on Twitter. It wasn't always mean. Sometimes it was blistering and necessary. But there were moments when the rebukes felt performative. Tools used more to position herself as the insistent conscience than to invite actual conversation. Our arguments changed. They were no longer about miscommunications or mismatched calendars. They became ideological sparring matches disguised as moral clarity. She would latch onto a principle, then use that principle to judge private failings. Once, after I agreed to a weekend trip with my sister, plans booked months earlier, she accused me of prioritizing family performatively to avoid engaging with her new advocacy deadline. You always pick comfort over confrontation, she said. It stung because it was true sometimes. But it stung more because it came bundled with an edge of moral superiority. It felt less like a plea and more like a verdict. I tried to adapt. I read more. I went to the trainings she recommended. I sat in on her meetings when she invited me. The problem wasn't that I was unaware, it was that her expectations proliferated. When I didn't immediately adopt her lexicon, when I joked lightly about an organizational strategy she had painstakingly developed, she'd bristle, as if I'd committed a breach. I found myself calibrating my language, approving my jokes on an internal moral compass. The intimacy that had been easy began to feel like careful navigation. Other people noticed. My sister Claire, who'd known me since childhood, remarked that Olivia seemed to have an answer for everything, except for how to be gentle in private. She's brilliant, Claire told me over coffee one afternoon. But do you ever feel like you're in a lecture all the time? I said yes, but in the way you tell a loved one a small, almost private truth. It was complicated and perhaps my own failure to be encyclopedic about activism. We married because it felt right, because the good parts still outshone the frictions. Our wedding was small, held in a courtyard of a midtown church, ringed by friends who loved the politics of a good party as much as the principle behind it. She wrote a vow that made everyone cry. I promised to be present, to keep learning. Standing before her, I felt like I'd made the right choice. Even if the future would complicate what that promise meant. The first few years of marriage held their own kind of hazard, fatigue. Olivia's work escalated. She was traveling for panels, negotiating donor agreements, and managing a team that leaned on her like a North Star. I took on more of the domestic mental load. Appointments, bills, the care schedule of our aging dog, Simone. Because I believed commitments were shared. I worked hard too. Promotions came and with them more responsibilities. But in the quiet of our apartment I began to feel a misalignment of valuation. My administrative choices were invisible labor. Her strategic public wins were visible markers of worth. There was a night that, in retrospect, stands as a hinge. It was at a fundraiser for reproductive rights groups. Big donors, soft lighting, the kind of event where politics and aesthetics coalesced. Olivia was on a panel about grassroots organizing and came away energized. The after-party swelled with applause and compliments. She accepted a string of congratulations with a brilliant, slightly rehearsed humility. Then someone, an old friend, loud in the way that only longtime colleagues can be, made a joke about how I, the quiet policy analyst, had once tried to help stage a campus rally and failed spectacularly. It was a small joke, tossed like a paper plane, and Olivia launched it like a spear. He failed because he didn't put in the labor to learn, she said to the group. With that clarity that made people lean in. I tried to teach him. But he never took it seriously. There was laughter. The kind that lands colder than intended. I felt something happen, like a switch being flipped to reveal me as a project rather than a partner. The room shifted, the air filled with the smell of victory. I smiled, then left to the balcony to breathe. When she joined me, there was that familiar tilt, the gentle rebuke dressed as concern. You always take things so personally, she said. You need to be less defensive. I'm not defensive, I managed. Because the script of our life had lodged in my throat. You embarrassed me in front of people I care about. She looked at me, and for a second I thought I saw the woman who had, early on, bristled at inequality with a tenderness for the person directly affected. Instead, she hardened and said, people will always misunderstand things. You should know how to handle it. That night I didn't leave. But I started to keep a ledger in my head. It was petty, but it thickened into a kind of accounting where small erosions piled into a dam that eventually broke. I fixed more dinners, I made more conciliatory texts. We went to couples counseling twice. An earnest experiment that landed us in a room where Olivia catalogued offenses and I tried to explain the exhaustion I felt. The counselor, a gentle woman named Dr. Ramirez, suggested we practice reciprocity. Olivia nodded. The word seemed to sit oddly on her tongue as if it might tarnish an ideal. She would say she understood and then, in private, pivot to a critique of the group's misperception of her role. There were good things. Olivia could be kindness incarnate in small moments. Leaving a note on my laptop before an exam. Brewing tea when I was sick. Defending my work in conversations with colleagues who would have otherwise reduced me. But those moments began to feel conditional. Kind if aligned with her narrative. Withheld if they threatened her image. Where she used to ask after me because she wanted to know how I was. She started asking in order to demonstrate her engagement publicly. Check-in selfies before a panel became a form of moral accounting. We had friends who watched the narrative unfold. Maya, a longtime friend of Olivia's and a schoolteacher, told me once over an early morning run, she's not the same as she was in college. I wanted to say she had always been focused, but I didn't. Instead I told Maya, I think the visibility changed us. She nodded. Famed as funny things, she said, as if that were a diagnosis. The night that finally split us was not dramatic so much as definitive. It happened at a community forum where Olivia was moderating a conversation about corporate responsibility. The room was full, activists, grad students, donors, a smattering of municipal officials. She had been prepping for weeks and was energetic in that way that precedes performance. I was there to support her, to take notes and to be her quietly proud husband. During the Q&A, a well-meaning attendee asked Olivia about the emotional labor activists often asked of partners. The private work that sustains public life. It was a soft question and many in the room shifted. Olivia gave an answer that, on paper, was exactly her, articulate, historicized, and sharp. Then, with a practiced smile, she pivoted to me. I've had to do the emotional labor of being patient with people who aren't as politically literate, she said, naming me in a way that was both intimate and public. My husband has been supportive. Yes. But he also benefits from systems he doesn't interrogate. A murmur swept the audience like wind. Across a field, I felt something unfurl inside me. An exposure so raw it made me feel like I had been hung out to dry. I stood, because in that moment leaving felt more like exercising agency than staying. She reached for my hand, but I didn't take it. I walked out of the hall and sat by the curb in the cold, listening to the muffled applause and the laughter that I felt safe to imagine was at my expense. We tried to mend it, briefly, with a domestic ordinary, pizza, an old movie, the dog curled between us. But the story had a new current. She apologized the way people do when they mean to return to the prior equilibrium. A fast, business-like remorse that asked little of me but demanded absolution. I pretended. I wanted to believe love could weather this. I wanted to be the steady that once anchored us. Weeks later, at brunch with a group of friends, she made another offhand critique. Not of systems this time, but of my emotional reactions to stress. You get overwhelmed, she said to our table in a tone that assumed correction. You need to build tolerance. I know cause and effect. And sometimes you're just not resilient. At that point the ledger overflowed. I had spent years polishing the edges of myself to fit the contours of our shared life. I had uplifted her career whenever I could because I believed in its value, and because I loved her. Watching her reduce me, subtly and then increasingly overtly, wore me down. I left. Not in a spectacle but in a sequence of small decisions. A request for space. Then separate rooms. Then a lawyer's consultation out of precaution. We tried mediation, but the sessions turned into debates about values. Her idealism against my desire for practical tenderness. She accused me of expecting her to be smaller. I accused her of making me invisible. It was ugly in the way that truth is when it strips away comfortable lies. We divorced the following year. It was amicable by legal standards, which made it feel limp in the emotional sense. We shared custody of Simone until she passed. We divided the books, the terracotta pots, the way our apartment smelled in the morning. The paperwork was neat, the ache was not. After the divorce, Olivia's career continued its upward arc in a way that was predictable. Higher profile roles, more op-eds, an eventual move to a national nonprofit. She lectured, wrote, and expanded her platform. I met someone else, Renee, a quiet graphic designer who liked late-night walks, who learned the names of my plants and never felt the need to narrate my shortcomings in public. With Renee, I found an ordinary tenderness that was deliberate and reciprocal. We married 3 years later. It was simple and small, more marked by private jokes than mission statements. Olivia's trajectory also shifted, slowly and not entirely driven by humiliation. Success didn't harden her forever. There were cracks in her armor, moments of introspection she sometimes shared in long emails. After a particular scandal where a tweet was taken out of context and flamed, she retreated for a season. Noticed by the press and scrutinized by the very communities she served. She started to see the costs of always being right on top of everything else. She began therapy, first for stress and then, later, more seriously, for patterns of behavior she'd rarely allowed herself to examine. I learned about her struggle through mutual friends. Maya told me over coffee that Olivia had started meeting with a therapist who specialized in relational dynamics. She's reading more literature on attachment, Maya said. She's trying to understand why she pushes people away. Then, one autumn evening, I got a message. It was from Olivia. The text was plain. Can we talk? Not for headlines. For me. I debated replying for a long hour. The post-divorce rules I'd drawn were kind but firm. No rehashing. No triangulating through mutual friends. I replied, okay, coffee? She said yes. We met at a small cafe that smelled faintly of cardamom and espresso. The kind of place she'd have once criticized for its gentrification but now frequented out of a quieter pleasure. She looked different in a way that had nothing to do with clothes or hair. It was the softening of someone who had stopped habitually being on. She ordered tea, stirred it slowly, and then looked at me. "I want to be honest," she said. "I've been doing a lot of work. Therapy. Reading. Trying to unpack she swallowed. Why I elbowed people out of my life in the name of principle. I can see, now, how I used my ideology as a shield. I wanted to be unassailable." Her voice snagged. "I used to think if I maintained moral clarity, that would be enough. I didn't realize how often I made myself the only voice in the room. Especially in our room." There was a long silence. I had rehearsed responses in my head. Vindication. Tenderness. A map of grievances. But none of that mattered in the face of the person sitting across from me. The same woman who once composed luminous protest essays. Now vulnerable. "I'm sorry for how I treated you," she continued. "For breaking you down in front of friends, for making you feel like a problem to be solved. That wasn't love. I thought I was doing the right thing. I didn't know how to be gentle." Her apology was not the polished one that sought absolution and then moved on. This was messy, repeated, and asked nothing of me. It was a humility that had been earned in the hard work of self-reflection. I told her I appreciated it. I told her I had found a tenderness I didn't expect to find again. I told her I forgave her. In that slow, separate way that doesn't demand a reunion but releases its holder from bitterness. Olivia's eyes filled. She said, simply, "I regret losing you." She did. The regret was not theatrical, it was a kind of quiet catalogue of small losses. She missed my bookish habits. The way I would make tea at 2 in the morning when I couldn't sleep. How I would hold the grocery list like a map and make even mundane errands into small adventures. She missed being known as someone who could be cared for, unadorned by a platform. "I used to think vulnerability was weakness," she told me. "But it's not. It's the only way I could really connect." She said she'd learned that lesson slowly and painfully. That reliability and presence were not beneath the work of dismantling systems but integral to it. That being faithful in private did not negate public action, it amplified it. We talked for hours. We traced the map of where things had unraveled and where they had once been tender. We laughed at the old, small things. The time our ancient toaster caught fire and we took photos of the scorched bread like evidence of youthful incompetence. We cried over other things. The conversation was not a reconciliation so much as a mutual inventory and a mutual release. She asked, tentatively, if there was any chance, if I could imagine a different life. I didn't say yes. There were new commitments, new rhythms. Saying yes would have been reductive, like smoothing over what we had learned with a patchwork. The right response was more complicated. "I don't think we can go back," I said. "But I don't want you to carry that loss as a punishment forever. You deserve the work you've been doing." Olivia nodded. She looked at her hands and then back at me. "I know," she said. "I want to be the kind of person who knows how to show up and who understands that change isn't just in public declarations. I want to be liked and also listened to. Not because I demand it, but because I can accept it." We left the cafe with a clarity that felt like a benediction. We did not rekindle the lives we had built since then. Mine with Renee, hers with a work that still mattered but with more margins. Required respect for the seasons of our lives. Yet the conversation marked an end to the bitterness. It marked a beginning for Olivia in the sense that she began to practice tenderness in a way that was not performative. Small gestures that did not require an audience. She called my mother on her birthday that year, unprompted, and helped organize a neighborhood potluck without broadcasting it to her followers. She learned, slowly, that humility was not a betrayal of principle but a complement of it. There is a lesson in all of this that lives in the quiet, non-viral moments. That love is a practice as much as a feeling. And that public righteousness does not substitute for private humility. Olivia's regret was not a dramatic arc where she realized she had been wrong about everything. It was a quieter grief for the ways she had missed people in her pursuit of rightness. It was also, if she was honest with herself, an admission that being right in public is less meaningful if it costs the people who keep your life together. Feminism, true feminism, was never about elevating one person at the expense of another. It was about recognizing dignity where it was owed and sharing power in ways that left room for tenderness. Olivia's journey is evidence of the difficult humility that comes with aligning your public voice and private actions. I still think about the early years sometimes. About the way a glance could read like a manifesto and how once two people moving toward justice could also learn to love each other in ways that made them better. I don't regret the marriage, it taught me boundaries and the language of asking for what I needed. I am grateful for what I learned from Olivia. About politics, yes, but also about the grace of being held accountable. She regrets losing a loyal husband. Good. I hope she carries that regret into the small practices that will keep her loved. In the end, we are messy and hopeful creatures, trying to enact ideals in a world that insists on compromise. We will make mistakes. We will hurt people we love. The better we get at noticing those mistakes and repairing them without spectacle, the better we get at loving. Olivia's regret became, for her, a curriculum. One that taught her to pair her fierce public mind with a softer, private heart. And maybe that is as good an outcome as any. Not a return to what was, but a better reckoning for what comes next.